listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Tonight, we're going to discuss the lost science behind the They Live glasses. If you've ever seen John Carpenter's movie They Live, you know that this movie has had a very profound impact in conspiracy culture, and you also know that it's a sort of allegory for things that really go on in this world about the social engineering that goes on. But what you may not have known is there is an actual science behind the sunglasses from the movie They Live. And this is a science that dates back to the very early part of the 1900s and some discoveries made by some individuals at that point in regards to being able to apply chemical filters and screens to lenses in order to actually be able to observe the human aura. Now, this is a very interesting thing in and of itself, but this is actually the basis for where the idea of the sunglasses comes from, as we'll discuss. And you may have seen a little bit of this elsewhere out there on the internet, some discussions of this. Well, I went back and I found the original documentation here of this process that they used to make these special lenses or screens in order to be able to see the human aura, and they've made observations and recordings thereof from there. So this is an interesting thing in and of itself, because they were able to determine a lot of information with this method, and this is the first time they claim that scientifically they were able to observe and measure the human aura and make some factual statements about it, not relating back to the occult sciences. Now, the gentleman who put together this book talking about this, he approached it from a strictly scientific observation point. He tried his best not to consult back with any of the occult teachings about the human aura and the things that they claim to know through clairvoyance and other people within the occult sciences. So he objectively measured some things. He was able to make some observations. He was able to tell an awful lot about an individual based upon the aura that they could observe. And this is part of where this comes from. So when you see the movie They Live and you see Roddy Piper put on the sunglasses, and then he's able to see things as they really are behind the veil, this is a loose allegory of being able to perhaps peer into spiritual realms and see the true background facade that goes on behind the physical imagery that we see. It's a great allegory. It's a fantastic movie. If you've never seen it, well, you don't know what you've been missing. I think you need to really, truly go ahead and check this movie out if you have never watched it. It is certainly a classic, and it'll tell you a great many things about the social engineering status of our society. But aside from that, this is where the portion about the sunglasses comes in, because they do have methods of observing some of these subjective things like the human aura that they could do in ways in which are repeatable and measurable in scientific method types of ways. So that being the case, this is something that's been known behind the scenes for a long time. And of course, if you go and look at it, they'll largely probably try to discredit anything like this. But certainly, these people had some results. So we're going to be reading, like I said, from one of the original sources of this idea that you're able to apply certain chemicals to a type of screen or glass in order to be able to see auras. And we're going to be reading from a book titled The Human Atmosphere, or The Aura Made Visible by the Aid of Chemical Screens, and this was written by Walter J. Kilner, B.A.M.B., a late electrician at St. Thomas's Hospital, London. This was written originally in 1911. It's copyright 1911. This is a 1937 reprint that was made available at Boston Medical Library in America. And we're going to read directly from the book here, and we're going to put some of the dots together for you tonight. And you'll be able to know that perhaps there was something real and observable that could be noted from the use of special glasses for the observation of things how they really are in perhaps the etheric or the spiritual realm of things, which is wherein the puppet show really goes on. It's the behind-the-scenes look. It's behind the veil. You can see behind the veil who's pulling the strings, what's pulling the strings. That is what was alluded to in the movie They Live. And certainly there's real science to back the use of sunglasses that functioned in that way. And we'll touch on a couple more notable points here and how it relates to the movie itself as we go through here. But let's begin. We're going to read from the preface. The perception of the human atmosphere or aura by the sole employment of material means at once makes the phenomenon a physical question. From the first moment of seeing the human atmosphere or aura, I determined to investigate the subject apart from all occultism and to remain unbiased. Did not read any accounts of the aura until a large number of patients, over 60 of them, had been inspected. As all the descriptions and references to the aura that could be found were, without exception, in occult works, and afforded little assistance to physical investigation, I have decided to insert no quotations. This resolution places me in a peculiar position of having no authorities to fall back upon, which in some ways is an advantage and a disadvantage in others. I'm going to pause for a moment there. So, Mr. Kilner here, he did not make any presuppositions about the things he was observing in the human aura through the use of his chemical screens that he made to be able to observe this. And this is the first time in scientific literature something like this showed up. You see, the only sources he had to fall back upon were from the occult and from the observations and claims of the clairvoyants through the various secret schools. He didn't want to go there. He didn't even look into this stuff until after he made his observations and had recorded them with over 60 patients, in which he used these screens to see their auras. And then, unfortunately, the only resources he had to go back to were from the occult in order to garner some more information. So he did so after the fact. And wouldn't you know, he found out that perhaps there might be something to some of what's been presented in some of the occult teachings. But he had made for the first time the scientific observations of this in a real physical world sense through the use of these special screens that he set up. And he says there's advantages in doing things this way, but there's also disadvantages. So let's continue into the preface from there. The title of Human Atmosphere, a Happy Inspiration of a Friend, is especially appropriate to the subject because it conveys a clear idea to the general public, while the term aura, notwithstanding its definition, and its definition is given here, it says, quote, any subtle, invisible emanation, effluvium, or exhalation from a substance as aroma of flowers, etc., end quote, and that's from Webster's Dictionary. And he says, notwithstanding its definition, is confined to people possessing some knowledge of occultism. The word aura, however, has been retained for shortness and convenience, as atmosphere would be misleading when used alone, and when combined with human is, to say the least, cumbersome. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So he refers to the human atmosphere here in the book. This is what he's talking about, because this is how he termed it, to try to step away from the occult connotations. But for ease of use, he will use the term aura in its place in portions of this, because it is cumbersome to say human atmosphere all the time, and most people wouldn't know what you're talking about when people are familiar with the term aura. So they know what an aura is, but they don't know what a human atmosphere is. Now, they're one and the same, but this is just the scientific measurement and validation of the aura. So this is interesting in and of itself that this was able to be done. And we'll get into exactly what he used to do this a little later. But let's continue. We'll finish out the preface here. It's a short preface. So he says, after what has been said about the desire to be perfectly free from occultism, it may seem strange that the expression etheric double has been employed. This name was borrowed from theosophic books, as no appropriate term has yet been devised. And it's signed W.J.K. W.J. Kilner. Ladbroke Grove, London, 1911. And that's the end of the preface there, folks. So essentially, he uses the term etheric double because he doesn't have any better terminology to describe what he has been able to observe through his scientific experimentation. And see, this is repeatable if you use the same methods that he used, and it has been repeated. There's something to this. There's definitely an energetic field around the human being that we know as an aura. This is a real thing, and observations can be made from it, and things can be known about it. This is the context of the book, and he was able to prove this scientifically through the use of physical methods. He's not depending upon occultism or clairvoyance or anything of that sort to see this. He's actually devised screens or lenses wherein you can look at this and see this. Now, how exactly this works, I don't know. I'm just reporting to you what was recorded in this book. And this is something that kind of got pushed on the back burner for a long time and is probably very much denied by the mainstream, but we have this analog record that this has been done. So let's get right into it. The first chapter here. The human atmosphere, or the aura, made visible by the aid of chemical screens. The aura of healthy persons. And I'm going to pause for a moment. There are also drawings in this book where he's measured and observed different types of auras with different people, healthy people, unhealthy people, children, women, men of all different ages and health conditions. And he was able to observe noticeable changes in their auras depending upon what their condition is. And we'll get to that. So this is an interesting book to pick up. You can find a PDF copy of it for free online if you know where to look. I believe Internet Archive is a place that might have this one if you wanted to check there. But it is an interesting read for sure. And certainly we can see there's something to the idea of the human aura and how observations of the aura can help to tell very vital information about a person. So let's read on. Hardly one person in 10,000 is aware that he or she is surrounded by a haze intimately connected with the body, whether asleep or awake, whether hot or cold, which, although invisible under ordinary circumstances, can be seen when conditions are favorable. This mist, the prototype of the halo or nimbus constantly depicted around the saints, has been manifested to certain individuals possessing a specially gifted sight who have received the title of clairvoyants, and until quite recently to no one else. The cloud or atmosphere, or as it is generally termed, aura, is the subject of this treatise insofar as it can be perceived by the employment of screens containing a particular or a peculiar chemical substance in solution. It may as well be stated at once that we make not the slightest claim to clairvoyancy, nor are we occultists, and we especially desire to impress on our readers that our researches have been entirely physical and can be repeated by anyone who takes sufficient interest in the subject. As long as the faculty of perceiving the aura is confined to a few individuals, and ordinary people have no means of corroboration or refutation, the door to imposture is open. Since this has been the case up to the present time, the subject has always been looked on askance, but there is no more charlatanism in the detection of the human aura by the methods we employ than in distinguishing microbes by the aid of the microscope. The main difference lies in the claim of some people that they are able to perceive the one through the possession of abnormal eyesight, while no one has had the hardihood to assert that they had the power of seeing an object 1,000th of a millimeter in length without instrumental aid. There cannot be the smallest doubt as to the reality of the existence of an aura enveloping human beings, and this will be in a short time a universally accepted fact. Now, that it can be made visible to anyone possessing normal eyesight It would indeed be strange if the aura did not vary under different circumstances, and we firmly believe that a study of its modifications will show that they will have a diagnostic value. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now, the author here is claiming that now anybody can see the aura through the use of these observing tools that they made, in much the same way you could look at microbes under a microscope. You can see the aura through the use of these special lenses that have been designed. And he makes the prediction here that the human aura will become an accepted fact because now they've been able to scientifically prove it and measure it. Well, this never came to pass, folks. And I'm sure there's reasons for that. They would rather the public be ignorant of the truths of this concept of the aura surrounding man. Because there's a lot of implications that could be made if that's a true thing, right? And it would reify some of the old occult belief systems if that's the case as well. And they don't want people to have this means of knowledge. He also makes claims that this has diagnostic value if you can see this, and we'll get a little bit into that. So let's go ahead and continue with the reading. So he says, we must ask the indulgence of our readers while we make a few personal remarks. Everything that has been stated in this book as being a fact is true, but we know that enthusiasm and imagination are wont to lead experimenters astray, and we have consequently endeavored to do our best not to overstate any incident. This in one part of our subject is most difficult because so much depends on subjective vision. It is only fair to add, however, that sight is our most perfect sense, and consequently, we may perhaps have been able to distinguish objects a little in excess of the average, and may thus have perceived effects which might have escaped the notice of other observers. Some of the deductions may be thought, and perhaps rightly, to be too dogmatic, since they are founded upon such a small number of cases, but our excuse is that they have been brought forward with the intention of there being working hypotheses to assist in future observations. The discovery of a screen capable of making the aura visible was by no means accidental. After reading about the actions of the N rays upon phosphorescent sulfide of calcium, we were for some time experimenting on the mechanical force of certain emanations from the body, and had come to the conclusion, whether rightly or wrongly, that we had detected two forces beside heat that could act upon our needles, and that these forces were situated in the ultra-red portion of the spectrum. There was a hitch in our experiments, and in the early part of 1908, we thought that certain dyes might assist us. After considering the different spectra, and as far as we could, ascertaining their properties, we made trial of several, and fixed upon one, which in this treatise will be called spectaronine. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So he named this substance spectaronine, this dye that they used in their lenses in order to be able to see the aura, or what they perceived to be the aura, which is somewhere in the ultra-red spectrum, is what he's claiming here. So let's go ahead and we'll continue on. So spectaronine, and he said that would be most likely to be of use. Now, what is spectaronine? There's a footnote here that we're going to read. Because he named it this, not knowing what it was exactly. Well, he knew what the chemical constituent was. But you see, he kind of made this patent-pending process for developing these lenses using what he called spectaronine. And what is spectaronine? Let's read and see in the footnote. It says, some friends who have carefully considered the question recommend the real name of the dye employed to be divulged. You see, he had named it spectaronine. But here's the real name, and you may have heard it. This we are quite willing to do, only it is too late to alter the term spectaronine throughout the text, as the book is in the hands of the printers. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So he had called it spectaronine originally while writing the book, and some of his friends and colleagues urged him to say the real name of the dye used rather than the term he came up with for it, just for the sake of science, for the sake of posterity, for the sake of recording what it is. And this is what he did. He was willing to do it, so he added it as a footnote to the book. But throughout the course of the book, he will refer to it as Spectara 9. So Spectara 9 throughout the text of the book is how it was referred to. But the real name of the dye is dicyanin. The blue screens accompanying the book merely contain a solution of dicyanin, and the red contain carmine. These 4 screens are the only ones necessary for ordinary observation of the aura. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So in the original distribution of this book, he included a pair of glasses where observers can use these to see the aura, containing these chemicals. Now there's 4 chemicals that were used in the making of these lenses, these 4 screens. One of them was dicyanin, which seems to be one of the keys to the whole concept here of being able to see the aura. Another one is red, containing carmine. So we have carmine and dicyanin. But there's also 2 other chemicals, as we'll see here when we continue. He also goes on to say here in the footnote, there is evidently a great difficulty in the manufacture of these thin, flat cells, as we could find no one in Great Britain or in America who would undertake to make them. But at last we have succeeded in finding a foreign firm able to construct them. So making these lenses is difficult, folks. So we have here, remember, those 2 substances, carmine and dicyanin. Okay? And then we're going to continue past where the footnote is. And we'll reveal the other 2 substances used here in the production of these lenses for anybody out there who wants to try to maybe trace the production of these back. As we were compelled to wait some time before we were able to obtain it, one night the thought flashed across us that the substance might make some portion of the above-mentioned forces visible, and if so, we expected it would be the human aura. This phenomenon we had heard about, but until that moment we had never had any intention of investigating it, as we believed it to be beyond our natural powers. As soon as the chemical had been received, screens made of glass coated with collodion and also gelatin dyed with it were made, but were found to be entirely useless owing to decomposition taking place immediately. Afterwards, a celluloid solution called Zapon, that's Z-A-P-O-N, was tried. This gave a better result, but in a few hours' time it too lost its color. Subsequently, solutions in alcohol of different strengths in glass cells were employed. These seem, on the whole, to be satisfactory, but there is a tendency after a time for color changes to take place, even if kept in the dark as much as possible. As a rule, only 2 screens are necessary, one containing a solution of Spectara 9 in alcohol, which, by the way, folks, is this combination of dicyanin and carmine, and a second less dilute. Others of various strengths, with and without the addition of other dyes, have been tried, but these were only for purposes of experiment under differing circumstances. For ordinary work, these are unnecessary. However, another kind of screen will be found useful for differentiating the separate parts of the aura, which will be described later on. Going to pause for a moment here. So now we have some confirmations in the scientific realm of things, of some things that are talked about in occultism. You see, he's talking about different parts of the aura. And this would pertain to some things that are taught in occultism by the supposed clairvoyants, that you have these different bodies. You have the etheric body, you have the astral body, you have all of these different combinations of bodies that interpenetrate through these different spiritual worlds, and they can be seen and observed in different ways. This is what this is talking about. So you can see these different portions of the human aura. That's what's being implied here. So he had said at the outset they tried to avoid occultism as much as possible so that they could be objective in their observations, but we find, as always, ties back to these occult teachings because that's the only thing they had to go with in order to try to better describe what they'd been seeing, or to kind of add a little more context to what they were seeing. But as far as the screens themselves, let's get back into it. So directly, a screen was finished. We looked at a friend through it, and instantly saw around his head and hands a faint grayish cloud, which we considered could be nothing else but the aura. After a few minutes, we were surprised to find that we could continue to see the aura without the intervention of the screen. This power did not last long. However, it was renewed by looking at the light for a few seconds through a dark screen. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now, what's being revealed here is through the use of these specially dyed screens, they were able to observe the aura, and then after looking at it for some length of time through the screen, they were still able to perceive or see it with their naked eyes after the fact for a short time. Now, in the movie They Live, this is not the case. When he takes the glasses off, everything seems to return to normal, but you'll notice he has a headache after wearing the glasses for a length of time. And that may relate to this property that's shown here, because I think later on in the mention here, he'll mention something about having a headache for some time afterwards. Now, what's the nature of this? I don't know. But remember, he uses this substance he calls spectaronine, which is a combination of dicyanin and carmine in an alcohol solution with gelatin between two glass lenses contained therein, and there's the formula for this, folks. Carmine, dicyanin, this Zapon, as he calls it, a solution they tried that gave a better result, but they just wound up using alcohol instead. Regular rubbing alcohol, I would suspect, instead of this Zapon. I haven't really researched Zapon to see what it is. And there's also a type of gelatin. And they were able to make these lenses. They used some foreign company. He doesn't say who produced the lenses for him. But they were able to produce the lenses, and they were able to see the human aura with this for some time. And even after they removed the screen, they were still able to see it for a short time thereafter with their naked eyes. So let's continue here. It is interesting to note that this capacity for seeing the aura without the intervention of the screen is by no means uncommon, but generally exists only for a short while. At this period, every spare moment was occupied in using the screen for this and other experiments in connection with the perception of the aura. Consequently, we discovered to our cost that the spectaronine had a very deleterious effect upon our eyes, making them very painful, so much so that it was necessary to cease work for some days. On account of this, we strongly recommend all experimenters on this subject not to be continually looking through the spectaronine screen. Apparently, the action of this chemical is cumulative, so that we gradually gained the power of seeing the aura more and more plainly without the intervention of the screen. Ultimately, our eyes have become so permanently affected that under suitable conditions, we are able to dispense with a screen. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So it causes strain and stress on the eyes and may have a permanent deleterious effect on the eyes if you peer through this screen for too long. So that makes this kind of a, I don't know, it's a trade-off, isn't it? If you want to be able to see the human aura or have this perception, you may be causing permanent damage to your eyes in so doing by looking through this lens. Now, I find it interesting that gazing through this lens causes that type of effect, and as you see, it causes discomfort, which may be related to a headache, as we saw in the movie They Live. After he was using these glasses for so long, he would get a headache, so he had to take them off for a time. Did you ever wonder where this stuff comes from, folks? There's real science and real things behind much of what's presented to us in entertainment. No different for this movie, They Live. It's a great allegory for what goes on in the world. But perhaps this was the motivation for the use of the glasses and for the effects of the glasses on the character in the movie. So let's continue reading here. So, nevertheless, we think it expedient to look at the light for a few seconds through a spectronine screen before inspection, and even then we sometimes find the aura is better seen through a light one. At other times, we reverse holds good, though the conditions may be exactly similar in the two cases. The aura can only be satisfactorily defined when certain conditions are fulfilled. The light must not be too bright. The requisite amount must be determined at each observation and depends on whether a screen is being used or not. A rough estimate is that the body can just be seen distinctly after the observer has become accustomed to the dullness. The light ought to be diffused, coming from one direction only, and falling on the patient equally all over. Certainly, the best arrangement is obtained when the observer is standing with his back to a darkened window, while the patient faces it. An alternative method, if the room is sufficiently large and open, and the only one that can be employed at a patient's house, is to have a tent similar to the X-folding portable darkroom as used for photography, except that it must be lined with black instead of the ordinary yellow material, and the front curtains must be removed. The tent is placed with its back to the window, and the patient stands inside when he will be evenly illuminated. All the windows in the room, except the one at the back of the tent, should be completely darkened, while this one must have the blind drawn more or less as required. The chief objection to this arrangement is that the observer has to stand facing the light, which is not so comfortable for any part of the inspection, and is especially inconvenient for the observations connected with the complementary colors, as will be described later on. Occasionally, it is possible, at a patient's house, with a little maneuvering, to be able to place the tent with its opening facing the window. When this is done, inspection is rendered much easier. It is essential to have the black background as dead black as is obtainable. Most of our investigations have been conducted in a small room with only one window. This window is fitted at the top with an ordinary blind, and from below, a blind of black serge can be raised to any height required. The serge allows a considerable amount of light to pass through it, in fact, too much, except on very dark days, but the amount can be regulated by pulling down the ordinary blind. This arrangement is also very convenient, as a slight gap can be left between the two blinds, so as to allow much more light into the room when the patient is being observed through the dark carmine screen, and also occasionally when the complementary colors are employed. Opposite, and about 8 feet from the window, is a movable pole supporting black and white curtains, either of which can be used as wanted. The white background is necessary for certain observations, which will be described farther on. These are all the arrangements that are required. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So think in terms of these screens or glasses that were made, looking much like if you grew up in the era that I grew up in the 1980s and whatnot. Think of the old 3D movies, how they used to make these glasses. The one lens was red, the one was blue. Same kind of thing going on, except they used these specific dyes in them. So this is likely what the glasses looked like. They probably had one reddish lens with the carmine and one bluish lens with the dicyanin that allowed people to observe through these lenses and see the aura. Now, what they're saying is the lighting conditions had to be right in order to observe this. And we could see how that could be an important thing. It has to be just light enough that you could clearly see the outline of the person, but still dark enough that there's not any other ambient light coming in to contaminate the field, so that you could observe some of these things, some of these properties of the human aura. And that's what was done here. So they performed repeatable experiments. They used these same types of setups and were able to observe certain things. So that's the important thing to keep in mind here. So we know some of the substances used: dicyanin, carmine, alcohol, and gelatin. Between these two glass lenses, in order to make these screens to observe the human aura with. Now, there's much controversy in the modern conspiracy culture about this dicyanin. Apparently, it's a very much controlled substance of sorts that is very difficult to get your hands on for some reason or another. And many have conjectured this could be why, because of its use in these lenses and these types of observations. So is there something to this? I think there is. I think there's a there. Let's be honest about it. I don't know exactly how in-depth that some of the experiments in this regard have gotten. These are just the initial findings of this Kilner guy. So we see this is the early history thereof, and a lot of this has disappeared into the background, into obscurity since that time. Now, is it because it's nonsense, or is it because there's something to it, and the powers that should not be in this world don't want you to know about it? That's the real question that remains. I don't have the definitive answer, but I think the simple fact that this could be done as a physical process and repeated should tell you something. There's something to it. There's definitely something to it, and we know that there are these energetic fields all around us that we don't physically generally sense in our limited 5 senses that we do have as human beings. But it doesn't mean they're not there. Certainly you could use the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, as an example. We don't see infrared, we don't see ultraviolet, but we know they exist, we know they're there. We know there are frequencies beyond what we're able to perceive. This might be a way in which you can use natural physical substances, or chemical screens, as he called it here, to see into some of those different frequency bands. So it's important to keep this stuff in mind because I think there might be something to it. There is one point that is important to bear in mind, namely that the patient should stand about a foot in front of the background so that shadows or marks upon it may not produce any optical illusions and thus vitiate the observations. Trouble of this kind is not likely to occur except when the observer is new to the work. While the patient is assuming the proper position, the observer takes the dark screen and peers through it at the light for half a minute or longer. This will influence his eyesight for a sufficiently long time, so that it will rarely be necessary to repeat the operation. However, repetition can be made as often as desired. He now darkens the room and regulates the light, and standing with his back to the window and opposite the patient, looks at him through a pale screen when he ought to perceive immediately, or, if not accustomed to the work, after a few seconds, a faint cloud enveloping the patient, which varies in health according to individual peculiarities. If the observer has already gained the ability of perceiving the aura without the intervention of the screen, he will usually find it to have some shade of blue. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now this is an important distinction to keep in mind. It'll have a shade of blue. The aura, for those who have actually used these screens, will appear to be a pale shade of blue primarily. But then we'll see later there's other observations that can be made. Let's read on. It is certainly of assistance in determining the color of the aura if the patient places his hands upon his hips and at the same time extends his elbows when, in the spaces between the trunk and the arms, the aura emanating from the body will be reinforced by that proceeding from the arms. When commencing a systematic inspection, it will be advisable for the patient first to face the observer and the light. The aura round the head will be best seen while he stands or sits with his hands hanging by his sides. Its breadth may roughly be determined by noticing how far it extends beyond the shoulders, and this permits the two sides to be compared because in some cases of disease, the aura will be wider or narrower on one side than on the other. Going to pause for a moment here, folks. So now this is where some of this stuff becomes more important. If you could observe somebody's aura and determine that they have some type of a disease based upon what their aura looks like, well, that could be useful for diagnostic reasons, can't it? And these are some claims that have been made by clairvoyants in the past, and some of those in the occult teachings about the aura, that they could see when somebody's unwell, and they could determine what kind of perhaps physical ailments they have based upon what they see in their aura, and can make recommendations based upon that. Maybe make corrections based upon that. You see, this opens up a whole other perspective on health science. When you can understand something like this, if you can apply something like this and find there's a reality to it. And this is just one of the observations that was made by these experiments by this guy and his colleagues. Let's continue. So it says, at this stage, attention ought to be paid to the general shape of the aura while the arms are hanging down, as this often differs greatly from that seen when they are uplifted. For the greater part of the inspection, it will be found advantageous for the patient to stand with his hands behind his neck, so that the aura from the axilla down the trunk, thighs, and legs may be seen uninfluenced by the aura proceeding from the arms. This is the time to determine the shape and size of the aura, whether it follows the contour of the body or whether it is wider by the trunk than the lower limbs, and, if so, how far it descends before it finally narrows. It is not uncommon for some abnormality of texture to be visible, but this, as a rule, can be differentiated with greater accuracy by the employment of special screens. Occasionally, the aura can be separated by its appearance into two, or very rarely, three distinct portions, but the verification of this division will be better made at a later stage of the examination. As soon as all the information as to the aura at the sides has been gained, the patient must be turned sideways so that the aura at the front and back may be similarly examined. If any suspicion should arise as to the aura being unequally illuminated, it must be, in addition to the foregoing inspection, viewed when the back is turned to the light, and again when turned sideways in the direction opposite to the one he previously assumed. By this simple means, a number of errors are eliminated. The aura envelops the whole of the human frame, but on account of the fineness of its texture and its transparency, it is only visible in sections. Consequently, when the observer wishes to examine the aura emanating from one particular spot, he will be obliged to turn the patient to a different angle, so that a silhouette of this spot may be made on the background. Generally, if the shape of the aura is the only thing required, it can be ascertained by the patient first standing facing the observer, and then sideways without any other movement. Considerations of the other portions of the systematic inspection must be deferred for the present. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now he's talking about ways in which they observed the auras of people. They had them stand in various positions and were able to make observations based upon that, make accurate assessments thereof, find commonalities, and find differences in the auras of people based upon age, gender, and health condition. And this is all recorded in this book, complete with diagrams that are given. These are the observations he made, and this opens up whole other possibilities in the field of health. Why has this stuff been hidden away for so long? Folks, you have to ask yourself, why don't more people know about this? This is science that was actually performed. And in my estimation, this was probably at the height of when science was at its best, is around the turn of the century, around the late 1800s into the early 1900s, after which time the modern edit began to take place, and much of this stuff was thrown into the background and forgotten about while they pushed forward other ideas, where other ideas took hold to shape our modern paradigm. And all of these things they were observing at the time and trying to quantify at the time disappeared into obscurity in the background, only pursued by some of those within the secret schools and within this framework of those who control things in this world. Many of these projects probably went on in secret after the fact by some of those who had a vested interest in them and keeping the results secret from the rest of the public. Examination of a number of people in good health shows not merely, as might be expected, individual differences, but also the existence of a corporate dissimilarity. Males, independent of age, possess the same characteristics of the aura after making allowance for individual peculiarities, as no two people are alike. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now you can make basic determinations of the aura based upon these observations. He's saying all males have similarities in their aura. That's interesting to know, isn't it? Let's read on. Quite the opposite is the case in females because their auras undergo a great alteration of shape at certain periods of their lives. In childhood, it coincides almost exactly with that of the male. In adults, it is much more developed, while in adolescence from 12 to 13 until 18 to 20 years, it slowly advances from the masculine type to that of adult womanhood. Inspection of a man discloses the aura enveloping the head fairly equally all around, it being about 2 inches broader than the width of the shoulders. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now you can know a little something about the aura. It extends about 2 inches off of the shoulders and off of the head when you're gazing at it in this way. This is the observation they made, and that's in the male, in the adult male. When he stands facing the observer with his arms raised and his hands at the back of his neck, the aura will appear by the side of his trunk narrower than round his head, following closely the contour of the body. Here it does not usually exceed more than 4 or 5 inches in width, or roughly speaking, 1/15 of his height. As soon as he has turned sideways, it will be seen down his back, about as broad as by the sides of the trunk, but barely as wide as in the front. In all these cases, it is similarly continued down the lower limbs, only sometimes being a little narrower. Around the arms, it corresponds with that encircling the legs, but is generally broader around the hands, and very frequently it projects a long distance from the tips of the fingers. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So now these are some very real measurements that have been observed and made by this experimentation through the use of these lenses about the human aura. And it makes some sense, doesn't it? And many of these things have been described by clairvoyance and the like in the realms of the secret schools for many years and the occult teachings for many years. This guy is reifying some of those ideas with his observations. Is there something to this? Like I said, I think there is. And it might be important. There might be some really good uses for this, at least diagnostically, if this can be repeated. And it is claimed it's repeatable by anybody who wants to take the time and the trouble, go through the pains of setting up this type of an experiment. It can be done. Let's read on. Before a girl has arrived at the age of 12 or 13, the description of the aura of the males will be equally applicable to her. Nevertheless, the texture of the auras is usually finer than that of a man, so that it occasionally becomes difficult to distinguish the edge of the haze. In like manner, but not to the same extent, the auras of young boys may be faint. This prevents children from being good subjects for early observations. On observing the aura of an adult woman, a characteristic alteration is found. Above the shoulders, round the head, down the arms and hands, it is very similar to that of the males. If she faces the observer with the hands placed behind the neck, the dissimilarity is at once noticeable. The aura is much wider by the sides of the trunk than in men, and broadens out until, at the level of the waist, it has reached its full extent. From here downwards, it gradually narrows until it reaches a point not higher than the middle of the thigh, where it finally contracts and follows the outline of the legs and feet. However, the point of final contraction may be anywhere between the place just mentioned and the ankles. As she stands sideways, the aura will be seen to be much wider at the back than at the front, and the broadest part is at the small of the back where it frequently bulges out. From thence it comes down from near the nates, following the contour of the legs and thighs. In front it takes the outline of the body, being a little wider at the chest and abdomen than lower down. It is not uncommon to find the haze more pronounced in front of the breasts and nipples, and this increase is evidently dependent upon the functional activity of the glands, as it is most apparent during pregnancy and lactation, but is occasionally the same just before or after menstruation. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So there's some very noticeable observations being made here. There seems to be something to this. Like, why would you make this up? Or how would you perceive this? How would you know something about this without actually observing it? So these are the observations that have been made and can tell some things about the health condition of people. And we see here there's differences between the auras of men and women. Noticeable ones. So this might be applicable in the modern era of social engineering as well. With all the gender confusion going on, if somebody can see the aura of the person, they can make that ultimate determination as to whether this person, no matter what they identify as, is either male or female, depending upon the natural study of things. So this is also an area of contention, but that wasn't dealt with so much in the era in which these experiments were taking place. But we can learn a couple things, and perhaps some of these recorded bits of data can be important here. Let's read on. So it says here, when the aura is fully developed, age does not produce any alteration, but disease may. And then it makes an allusion here to figures in the book here. They have diagrams that show good specimens of the aura of a woman in good health. And like I said, folks, if you could find this book, pick it up. Interesting read. There are diagrams in here of what healthy auras look like, what unhealthy auras look like, etc., based upon different health conditions. This might be an important diagnostic tool if it can be utilized in that way. And this has been hidden from modern science. It's been obscured from us. Why? Well, somebody has a vested interest in not having this out there. That would be my contemplation. I don't think any of this stuff has been largely discredited because it is repeatable if you have the ability to make the tools to do so. And like I said, there is some banter in the conspiracy community about this dicyanin being some type of a substance that's very difficult to get a hold of for whatever reason. You need special licensure or something of the sort to get it. That's my understanding. Why is that? Other than perhaps there's some important aspects to its use that go on. I don't know. I don't have the answers. Maybe it is just a half-baked conspiracy theory. But it would seem that there is some legitimate science here to the observation of auras and the application of diagnoses based upon those auras. And this in and of itself is an important concept, if it holds to be true. And this relates, once again, to things we've been shown in entertainment media. You see, they could produce some type of sunglasses or some such thing wherein you could see into other visual spectra that you can't see in the regular realm of things, and perhaps make observations based upon that. So this is an important notion, and if you think this is lost on the intelligence community, I think you're fooling yourself. I think there may be something legitimate here. Maybe something legitimate here that's been lost, that we need to rediscover. Anyway, let's go ahead and we'll continue with the reading here. Because now the author continues and he says, amongst healthy women, the aura shows many departures from the above examples. The modifications consist in the difference of width by the side of the trunk and the distance it descends before it has contracted to its fullest extent and follows the contour of the body. Besides, it will be noticed that the breadth in front of the body often alters, but not nearly to the same extent. At the back, changes are more frequent and varied. These are chiefly due to differences in breadth and the position of the final contraction. With one person, the outer margin of the haze is apparently quite straight from the level of the shoulders to the most prominent part of the nates, and from thence it follows the outline of the body downwards. With another person, it will bulge out at the small of the back, contracting when it reaches the middle of the thigh, or it may be near the ground before it follows the figure. Occasionally, the aura proceeds downward from over the head to the feet without coming near the body. This we consider to be the most perfect shape. Any deviations are due to undevelopment. The average width of the aura over a woman round the waist is 8 to 10 inches, and on some not more than 6 or 7 inches, but it may reach 12 or more. And then it gives a little figure here where it could show you to look at these various diagrams that are given. When a girl approaches the age of puberty, her aura begins to show an alteration, leaving the infantile form to attain, in from 4 to 6 years, the shape assumed by an adult woman. The change does not usually commence until a short time before menstruation appears, but never before the body has begun to develop. Exceptions to this are occasionally met with. For instance, a girl 14 years old, case number 9, shown in figures 7 and 8, had a marked transitional aura, but did not menstruate for 6 months after. The youngest child who showed any increase of aura was 13 and a half years old. She was a remarkably well-developed child for her age, but suffered from epileptic fits. 6 months previously, she had an infantile aura. 3 others of 14, 1 of 15, 4 of 16, 1 of 17, and 1 of 19 years of age possessed auras in a transitional state, while 2 others of 18 years of age had fully formed auras. One undersized, weakly girl, nearly 17 years old, who had never menstruated, retained a perfectly infantile shape of aura, which, however, was well marked. On the other hand, a tall, well-formed young woman, 25 years of age, who had an undeveloped uterus, and who had only menstruated 4 times in her life, the last period being 3 years ago, is the possessor of a very distinct aura, much larger than the average. Another woman, 42 years of age, who had both her ovaries removed 16 years ago, had a fairly marked aura quite up to the average in width by the sides of the trunk, but especially broad at the back and front. There can be no 2 opinions as to the enlargement of the female aura at the period of adolescence, but it remains to be proved whether this is entirely due to the functional maturity of the sexual organs, or whether the other changes which have taken place in the system contribute to its development. But this much can be confidently stated, as will appear later on, that menstruation has a subtle effect on the aura, while the changes in shape in early pregnancy are not very pronounced. During a later period, a great extension in the front of the breast and the lower part of the abdomen may appear, but this is only temporary and local. The subject will be discussed later on. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. So this guy has made quite a bit of observations quite a few observations about these various conditions in people and their effects on the aura that he was able to detect. And all of these things have been recorded. This is very interesting. I mean, at least we have this data to look at. Now, people probably don't take this data seriously, but it certainly is there, and I think there's some importance to it. So you could know some things based upon what we could infer from this data. You could know some things about a person by what their aura looks like. Isn't that an intriguing idea? It truly is, and I think there's a whole lost science behind this that needs to be considered. Let's read on. It says, for the sake of simplicity and to avoid unnecessary repetition in the above description, the aura has been treated as if it were a simple phenomenon, while in reality it is a composite. Later on, its elements will be fully considered, but for the present it will be sufficient to say that it can be divided into 3 parts. Going to pause for a moment here. Pay close attention to this. The aura can be divided into 3 parts, and these may or may not correspond with these various bodies that the occult schools say that we have, these spiritual bodies that accompany our own, the etheric form, the astral form, etc., etc., as has been discussed in the past on this program. From the vantage points of the various secret schools, they all name them something slightly different. But you have the vital body, as it's sometimes referred to, the etheric body, the astral body, all these different forms that interpenetrate these various spiritual realms in which we coexist and into the physical. And maybe this is what is being described here in the scientific literature given here, pertaining to the aura, the idea of the human aura. Let's continue reading here. So 3 parts, remember. He says it could be divided into 3 parts. So he says, first, there is a narrow, transparent portion appearing as a dark space, which is very often obliterated by the second portion of the aura. When visible, it looks like a dark band not exceeding 1/4 of an inch surrounding and adjacent to the body, without any alteration in size at any part. This will be called the etheric double. Going to pause for a moment here, folks, as he told us earlier in the book. He used this term based upon things he read in theosophic sources because he had no better terminology to describe this. So this is the etheric double, this first portion of the aura. The second constituent is the inner aura. It is the densest portion and varies comparatively little, or even not at all, in width, either at the back, front, or sides, and both in the male and the female follows the contour of the body. It arises just outside the etheric double, but very frequently it looks as if it touched the body itself. The third portion, or the outer aura, commences at the outer edge of the inner aura and is very variable in size. It is the extreme outer margin of this that has been taken for depicting the outline of the aura hitherto. When the whole aura is observed through a light spectronine screen, or a pale blue one, all the portions appear blended together, but the part nearest the body is the most dense. If, however, a carmine screen is employed, each of the factors will be distinguished, or should this screen be a fairly dark one, the outer aura will be eliminated altogether. The following descriptions of the auras are from a selection of persons in good health, varying in age from early infancy and upwards, and are typical. They are arranged according to age, first males and then females. So I'm going to pause for a moment here before we get into the case studies here and the descriptions. Just to point out, we have these 3 distinct portions of the aura that can be detected in this way through the use of these various screens, as described here. 3 different portions. You have the etheric double, the inner aura, and the outer aura, which may or may not correspond to these various bodies that the occultists claim we have in these various spiritual realms. It's an important distinction to keep in mind. It's an interesting one, and it gives a little bit of reification to some of the older occult ideas. So we have this scientific measurement thereof. But here he gives case study number 1. A fine, healthy infant, 15 hours old, was inspected whilst lying on its mother's bed upon a black cloth. Although seen under very unfavorable circumstances, his aura was plainly visible, and in color was gray tinged with yellow. As far as could be seen, it followed the outline of the body. This is the youngest child whose aura we have examined, and it may be interesting to note that both the mother and the nurse were able to see the cloud around him if they looked through the screen. When he had arrived at the age of 4 months, he was inspected again under more... Excuse me for a second. There it is. Okay. Lost my place here because there were some diagrams in between. Under more suitable conditions, being then placed on a sofa with a black cloth under him. His aura took the same outline as the body, being a little over an inch wide, with the exception of the part round the head, which was broader. The color had changed to a dark blue-gray. Case number 2. When a healthy male infant of 4 months old was examined while lying on a black cloth similar to the background behind him, his aura could be easily detected, being of a bluish-gray color. The outer aura was seen an inch wide around his body and limbs, but by the sides of the head it was a little broader than the width of the shoulders. When examined through a dark carmine screen, the inner aura was quite distinct, about 3/4 of an inch wide, showing well-marked striation. Case number 3. A strong and healthy lad, 5 years old, who had never had any serious illness. Well, he stood facing the observer. His outer aura appeared to be about 6 inches round the head. It came down by the side of the trunk about 3¼ inches, and was a little narrower by the lower part of the thighs and the legs. The inner aura could be plainly distinguished, being nearly 2 inches wide by the side of the head and trunk, and about 1¼ by the legs. When he turned sideways, the outer aura was found to be about 2 inches wide in front, and the inner aura about 1/4 inch less. Both these measurements were slightly diminished lower down. At the back, the outer aura was 2½ inches wide by the trunk, but not quite so wide by the lower limbs. Here, too, the inner aura was about 1/4 inch less than the outer aura. The color was a blue-gray. It is worthy of notice that in children, especially among males, the inner aura is almost as wide as the outer, and often the two can only be differentiated with difficulty. So I'm going to pause for a moment here. Like I said, I think some of these are very important observations. I think there's something to this. And if you go back and you look at some of the old occult literature talking about auras, you can start to make some correlations between what's being shown here in a very real physical sense through the observation through these screens that were used, and what has been said by alleged clairvoyants in the secret schools for many, many, many years about auras. I think there's something real to it, and I think it deserves more attention than what it's had. And certainly we could see the correlations to the use of these as a storytelling tool in the entertainment media, in the movie They Live. Certainly, there's importance here. It's an allegory for something more spiritual, but they used the guise of science fiction and alien invasion and stuff like that in They Live to tell the story of social engineering and all of these occulted sciences that go on behind the scenes. And certainly, you have to wonder where the motivation for these things comes from. And certainly, as a storytelling tool, the sunglasses may have found their origin with this old story, this old scientific observation given here. Now, I do have to do a little bit more background work into some of this and perhaps the methods used to produce these lenses to see what can be garnered from this and what can't be garnered from this, but this gives us a pretty good outline of what we could possibly expect. And like I said, this book, it is available in the public domain. You can find it. And I would recommend go look it up. It's very interesting and compelling. At the very least, we have these data points that we could use perhaps to form a baseline for further observations and study. Only problem is the powers that should not be have made it difficult, if not impossible, for the average person to obtain the substances necessary to repeat these experiments. And I think there may be a reason for that. But with that being said, let's continue on, because here's case number 4. A youth, 14 years old. He is rather tall for his age and has enjoyed good health all his life. His aura was well marked and a bluish gray. As he stood facing the observer, the outer aura was 7 inches round his head, by the side of his trunk 4 inches, and lower down 3½ inches. The inner aura was 2 inches wide all over the body. The etheric double was visible, being 1/8 inch wide. When he stood sideways, the outer aura was about 3 inches wide by his shoulders and nates, consequently for a male was rather wide at the small of the back. In front, the aura was 3 inches wide down the whole length. Case number 5. A very powerful man, 33 years of age. He was well proportioned in every respect and in robust health. His aura was blue with a little gray. The outer aura surrounded his head, a little wider than the breadth of his shoulders, all down his trunk, arms, and legs. It was 5 inches wide. The inner aura was extremely well marked, about 3 inches wide. Striation was remarkably easy to see. As he stood sideways, the inner aura was the same width both front and back, but the outer was a trifle narrower in front. The etheric double was clearly defined, being nearly a quarter of an inch wider. His whole aura was unusually coarse in texture. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks, so we could see some very basic commonalities in mind here. It would seem that a healthy person's aura tends to have this blue and gray coloration to it and can have various measurements that seem to be consistent across the board as far as their size goes around the body. So this is an important distinction to keep in mind, and as we get to some of the cases here where there's maybe some health issues going on, we'll see some differences. We're only going to go through a couple more of these, and we'll find a good place to wrap up here. The whole idea behind this, though, is there may be a very real science to some of this, where you could use various lenses stained with various chemical dyes to be able to see things beyond the normal spectrum of human sight. To see things, perhaps, that relate to this etheric portion of our reality, where you can see the aura. So this could be a truly important thing if science would take it seriously in the modern era. Case number 6. A female child, a week old, was inspected while she lay upon her mother's bed on a black cloth. The external conditions were extremely unfavorable, but with a little difficulty, the aura was seen as a greenish haze which followed the outline of the body, being very narrow, but around the head it increased a little, as might be expected. When this infant had arrived at the age of 4 months, corresponding with that of the first case study, she was examined a second time under better conditions. The aura was very difficult to perceive, as it was not nearly as distinct as expected, and was only half an inch wide round her body and rather broader round the head. The most interesting point was that the color had changed from greenish to a gray shade. Case number 7. A fragile, excitable child, 4 years old, rather small for her age but in good health, was observed in January of 1910. She had a very extensive aura for her age and size. The outer was 3 inches wide all over her body, except round her head, where it extended to nearly 5 inches. The inner was also distinct, striated, and 2.5 inches wide. The color was blue. Case number 8. A strong, healthy girl, 7 years of age, who had never had any illness. The color of her aura was blue. As she stood facing the observer, the outer aura was half a foot round her head. By the side of her trunk, it was 3 inches, gradually narrowing to 2 by her lower limbs. As she stood sideways, her outer aura measured 2 inches down the front and 3 at the widest part of the back. And lower down, it was 2 inches in width. The inner aura was 2 inches round her head and trunk. Elsewhere, only 1.5 inches. She showed no rays. Case number 9. And this is an interesting one now. This example is very interesting, extremely interesting, as we have been allowed to inspect her from time to time and thus able to follow the growth of her aura at the different periods of her early adolescence. She is a girl of 13 years of age in good health. She has lately been developing fast, but has not yet menstruated. In October 1908, she was inspected when her aura was found to be the same as in most young girls, following the outlines of the body being about 2 inches wide, except round the head where it was wider. The color was blue. After the lapse of 8 months, she had the appearance of that of a small, well-shaped, full-grown woman, but she had not yet as yet menstruated. Her aura had now entered into the transitional state. Around the head it was a little broader than at her shoulders. By the side of her trunk it was about 4 inches wide and about 2.5 by her thighs and legs. When she turned sideways, the aura showed an increase to 2.5 at the small of the back, but in the front was no more than 2 inches wide. March of 1910. She has grown a little and is a shapely girl, being just 14.5 years old, and is in good health. Her first period came just a month ago. The aura has enlarged. It is now 5.5 inches by the side of and over the head. As she stands facing the observer, along the trunk it is 4.5 inches in width, contracting further down to 2.5 inches. When she turns sideways, in front it is seen to be 3 inches, while at the back, at the widest part, it is 4, and gradually lower down it lessens to 2.5 inches. The inner aura is 2 inches wide all over the body. It is easily perceived and plainly striated. The etheric double could be just discerned. 4 months later, the aura had increased by the side of the trunk by a good 1/2 inch, but elsewhere it remained unaltered in measurement. This case is instructive, as the girl retained her juvenile aura quite 6 months after she had commenced her outward bodily development, and the aura, in its turn, began to evolve 12 months before she first menstruated. It is also a good example of the slowness with which the aura changes from the infantile to the adult type. So I'm going to pause after that case study to point out, over the course of time, the aura has been observed to change, especially in girls in this transitional period. Now, that's an interesting thing to consider. Think about that. It changes in size, and sometimes the colors change. And it's been observed that some of these people with health problems, their aura looks different. I'm going to skip past a bunch of these other case studies. These are mostly within healthy people, and see what we could find down here a little bit further. So, here's an observation that was made. Since the ratio between the height of the patient and the breadth of the aura is precluded, there seems to be only one way of obtaining the required standard available, and that is not a satisfactory one. This is to fix arbitrarily the limits of the average dimensions of the aura, and to take any deviations from it as abnormal. Taking this as a principle, all auras may be divided into 3 divisions: wide, average, or narrow. Roughly, the auras of women may be called average when they are from 8 to 10 inches broad by the side of the trunk in their widest part. The standard for men may be taken as from 3.5 to 4 inches and a half, and for children between 2.5 to 3 inches. As the auras of adolescent girls are changing from month to month, they will have to be considered each upon its own merits, as no hard and fast rule can be made. These figures have been decided on by experience only, and not by any scientific plan. Although this arrangement seems very simple, yet it is by no means always easy to decide whether a case is to be termed average or not. Taking one instance alone, suppose a woman had an aura by the side of the trunk a little larger than the limits laid down for the average width, and this contracted down the thighs and legs. In fact, being the hysterical type of aura, to below the average, under what heading should it be placed? This case, too, must be considered on its own merits. The following tables contain all the examples which have been investigated of 2 or more individuals of the same family up to date. The first table contains those cases where 2 generations are involved, and the second belongs to the same generation. In 2 instances, the same person comes into both tables. And like I said, there's a plethora of data here in this book showing various aspects of what the auras look like, and as we have heard here, they're able to infer some commonalities and some common sizes to the auras. Now, this is interesting too, wherein if you could develop a type of baseline for what's considered to be normal with an aura and not, which hasn't been done scientifically up until that point, you only had the observations of the clairvoyants within the occult teachings. And if you align some of what's been observed here scientifically with what much of what's been said by the clairvoyants in the occult realm of things, you'll find excuse me. You'll find commonalities between the two, which leads me to believe there's something more known about the human aura by those in positions of power than what we're led to believe, or what they would like us to believe about it. But at any rate, we have these observations that have been laid down. And there's a lot of questions that still need to be asked. Here's another little fact placed down here, an observation made by the scientists who were observing this. He says it's reasonable to suppose the outer aura of men has a coarser grain than that of women, but after allowing for this, fineness and transparency may be considered a higher type than coarseness and dullness. Later on, it will be shown that the more gray there is in the color of the aura, the more dull or mentally affected is the owner. Education is a factor which ought theoretically to have an immense influence on the aura by its refining influence, but the changes induced by it are so delicate as to be imperceptible by our present means of examination. Nevertheless, it is extremely probable that it has produced a congenital effect throughout heredity. So that's an interesting observation, too. The influence of heredity and temperament upon the aura is one of the most fascinating parts of this subject, and at the same time, it does not require a prophet to foresee that an inquirer in this direction is likely to reap a rich harvest. And that's the end of the first chapter of this book, folks. We skipped a lot of the case studies just to bear out some commonalities between all auras, so we notice a few things. Seems to be a lot of blue and grayish colors observed. Seems to be a variety of widths of the aura depending upon the age and gender of the patient being observed. But there are commonalities to be found, and we do know that in healthy individuals there are certain expectations, and when you see unhealthy individuals, there are deviations from that are discernible in the aura. There are 3 portions of the aura that can be observed in this method. The author calls them the etheric double, the inner aura, and the outer aura. And like I said, these may or may not correspond to some of the old occult literature talking about the various vehicles of man through the various spiritual realms. May or may not. I don't know. It's interesting to observe these things, though. Study the ideas, make associations, and we can know some things, but this book is very detailed into the observations that were made. The important portion is that this can be scientifically validated if you can just obtain the tools necessary to repeat these experiments as presented here by this author in this book. His name is Kilner. You can find this book, like I said, in the public domain. I think Internet Archive has it available. If you wanted to look at it, see the diagrams, see the charts with the data, and be able to obtain this for posterity, because I suspect that this is one that's going to be hard to find in the coming months and years. And there may be some real science behind what's been presented to us in entertainment media through the broader culture to normalize mind control operations. And it's been handed to us as an allegory in the guise of science fiction to show us how we're socially engineered and how it is possible for some people in this world to validate spiritual things through an observable scientific lens, both figuratively and literally here. And for some reason or another, one of the substances, if not more, that make these types of lenses possible to produce has been made extremely difficult to get a hold of. Why is that? I don't know. Is there a conspiracy in play to keep this way of observing things hidden from the masses? I don't know. I can't make that claim. But what I do know is it seems kind of odd that this one substance in particular seems to be extremely difficult to get a hold of, and we have this validated scientific research. We have this book, we have this recording of this information, of this data available, showing that there might be some validity to this. And why would somebody not repeat these experiments and see if they could reproduce some of the same data that has been presented here? I would argue there's somebody out there that doesn't want this research to go on. Either that or this research has gone on in secret behind the scenes, and there is more known about it. I don't know. This is just scratching the surface. You see, when I first found out about this dicyanin in the greater conspiracy culture and the talks about it, I didn't really delve too deeply into it until, of course, I was able to come across this original resource of it before the modern edit. And there's a lot of speculation that's been made about this. So now I've researched it, I saw this is a factual thing. It's not just hearsay. There is this substance, and it has been used to produce these lenses. Of course, it hasn't been used by itself to produce these lenses to be able to make an observation. Whereas if you just look at what the conspiracy culture puts out there, you would see that this dicyanin seems to be the important element to it, and maybe it is an important element, but if you're not pursuing the real science behind it and also using this carmine and the alcohol and the gelatin to produce the lens in such a way, it's not going to work the same. And maybe, just maybe, if people would take the time to go back to find the original documentation, they would know this. But I haven't heard any of this other stuff talked about in conspiracy culture, just dicyanin. There's other elements involved here. And there's real observations that can be made with this. And it affects things like the human aura and diagnostic ability for reading the aura to determine certain things. And I don't think it has anything to do with disguising aliens or anything like that, as is presented in science fiction culture, but it's all part of the social engineering that goes on, too. They have to put this stuff in plain sight for you. It's revelation of the method, but they're not telling you what it's really about. They present it as allegory, and many people take it literally. So you're not going to see lizard people by putting these things on. Let's put it that way. But maybe you can make some observations about auras, the human aura, the human atmosphere, as declared here by this author. So this is an interesting look behind the scenes at some of the lost science that has been, in my estimation, carefully hidden away from us for whatever reasons. And maybe we could know some things. There's some important information that could be garnered from this. If you can make diagnoses just by observing a human aura, this could be massively beneficial for people, can't it? I would think so. If you could tell somebody's unhealthy and be able to determine what kind of a health condition they have going on based upon that, and maybe do something to alter that, you can know a little bit of something, and you can perhaps help people before they become symptomatic if these things change in the way that the author claims here. So maybe somebody who is in the initial phases of developing some type of disease or health condition, it could be detected in the aura first, and then maybe some preventative methods could be applied to change back that aura back to a healthier state, and therefore change the body, as has been described throughout the occult teachings with this stuff. The manifestation begins in the spirit and then develops in the physical. If you could nip it in the bud before it becomes physical, then you could change things up. It seems like this might be an important thing to look at in the future, and I will explore this avenue of thought a little bit deeper. But as for now, we have run out of time for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this was informative and helpful, and you found some value in it. And I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. Have a good one now.